Good afternoon all. Thanks for joining today's webinar. Myself, Mr. Vipin. I'm the product manager for Clearswift from Bulwark Technologies. Thanks to Mr. Nick Hawk, the director of technical training from Clearswift, and he will be briefing you about the Clearswift portfolio today. So this webinar will be around 45 to 50 minutes, and at the end we can have the question and answer session as well. So once the question and answer session, at the end there is a feedback form session also. So I request all the attendees to participate in that. Let's start with today's agenda. So let's start with today's agenda. Introduction to Bulwark. Overview of HelpSystems Data Security Suite. Introduction to the Clearswift Adaptive DLP solutions. Complementing Office 365 with Clearswift DLP solutions. People to talk to, and the questions to ask to the end users. How to handle the objection handling from the end users. Let's roll with the next slide. Bulwark started operations in 1999, and we are specialized in cybersecurity WAD in this region, representing 25 plus vendors with their complete products and services. So we have 500 plus partners across the GCC. So our partnership with HelpSystems started in 2014, and we do have certified sales and technical team for Clearswift. So if we have, and we do have the regional presence in Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Saudi, and the UAE as well. So we do have a regional office in India also. So that's all from my side as of now. Let's hand it over to Mr. Nick to talk more about the Clearswift and HelpSystems. Over to you, Nick.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vipin. So the Clearswift solutions are designed to allow organizations to communicate and collaborate securely, safe in the knowledge that none of their critical information is being inappropriately exposed to people either inside or outside of the organization. Now, Clearswift were actually acquired by HelpSystems at the end of November last year as part of HelpSystems' drive to increase their security portfolio. And if you are familiar with HelpSystems, you know that they kind of have a wide number of solutions that fall into the security and the automation spheres. One of the overriding goals for HelpSystems isn't essentially to have two separate product sets of security and automation that never talk to each other. Actually, our goal is to look at how we can use security and automation to complement each other. So with the security solutions, we can give organizations the ability to protect their sensitive information, to enforce data classification policies, to control how PCI information or personally identifiable information is both accessed and shared inside and outside of their organization. But we look at how we can use the automation solutions to maybe remove some of the repetitive tasks for organizations to allow them to focus on the real high value tasks within the organization. So how can we automate penetration tests? How can we automate the responses to data loss or compliance violations? Equally, with the automation solutions, we're looking at ways where we can integrate the security wrapper around the automated processes. So some of you will no doubt be familiar with the GoAnywhere managed file transfer solution, which is an amazing solution which can allow for user-initiated or automated initiation of files and data sharing, and it can ensure that that data is shared in a secure manner. But what we can do with the security solutions is we can integrate those with GoAnywhere, and I'll cover this in more detail later on, to give your customers this additional wrapper of data loss prevention, of compliance implementation, or just protection from ransomware or malware attacks coming into the organization. What we're going to focus on today is part of the HelpSystems Data Security Suite, and the larger HelpSystems Data Security Suite allows organizations to understand what their sensitive information is, where it lives within the environment, how people are accessing it, and to essentially classify that data to make sure that it's only being shared with the right people, both inside and outside of the organization. The Clearswift solutions that we'll focus on today are part of this govern section here, and this is really giving organizations mechanisms to ensure that when they do have to share sensitive information, and we all do with our customers, with our business partners, with our outsourced payroll providers or healthcare providers, but we can ensure that the sensitive information is only being shared with the correct people, both inside and outside of the organization, and you can limit how that data is maybe being accidentally exposed to people outside of the business or inside of the business there. With the protection section there, this is around our secure managed file transfer side of things. So with GoAnywhere or the recently acquired GlobalScape enterprise file transfer solutions, we have the ability to integrate with those to ensure that, if you're using that to securely share your data, then we are making sure that you're sharing the right data with the correct people, either inside or outside of the organization. In terms of Clearswift, as I touched on, we were acquired by HelpSystems at the end of November last year. Clearswift ourselves, we've been around for more than 25 years, and we really focus in on protecting the organization's data from external threats or from those kind of internal, malicious or accidental data breaches or compliance breaches there. If you look at the Clearswift marketing collateral, you'll see that we talk about being the #1 provider of advanced content threat protection for critical national infrastructure. And certainly when you look at our customer base, around 70% of our customers will fall into the defense, the government and the finance verticals. But we actually have customers that fall across all of the verticals because, especially over the last 4 to 5 years, essentially every organization we talk to has some kind of need for protecting their sensitive information. It could be something as simple as their own employee details, or it could be their intellectual property if you're talking to manufacturing, oil, gas and whatever organizations, or it could be customer details, talking to hospitality like hotel and restaurant chains. Every organization across these verticals kind of understands the need to protect sensitive information. When you look at the Clearswift solutions, a lot of the articulated or the requested needs that we get from prospective organizations will be around protecting their organization, protecting their data from the external threats, the malware breaches, the ransomware breaches, and the phishing breaches. And we certainly have solutions that can allow organizations to limit the risks and guard against the risks here. And they can work alongside the more kind of traditional antivirus and sandboxing solutions to give your customers another layer of risk protection using different mechanisms to kind of try and keep ahead of the attackers. But actually, when we start to talk to organizations and we can drill into the requirements in more detail, we often uncover that they have requirements to protect their own sensitive information from data breaches, losing their intellectual property, or just their competitive edge. Or we can drill down and we can understand that they have compliance legislations like payment card information compliance, personally identifiable information legislation like GDPR, and all of the other variations around the world, or healthcare legislation, which means they have to protect and share the sensitive information. What we find when we talk to organizations is that organizations who have been down data loss prevention projects or compliance projects have actually found that typically they are very hard to do. And one of the key drivers Clearswift had about 10 years ago was we looked at the marketplace, we were talking to organizations who were struggling with DLP and compliance. And one of the key things they were telling us was, look, DLP is really tricky because the DLP solutions are very stop and block in their nature. They take a long time to define the policies for the organization, so it can often take a long time before you get to the protection phase of your DLP or your compliance project. And even when you finally get to that protection phase, maybe months or years down the line, because those solutions are very stop and block, because they might find one thing in Appendix D of a document that looks like it might be a credit card number or a social security number or something like that, they'll essentially block the whole communication, whether that's an email communication, whether that's a web transfer to OneDrive or Dropbox or a managed file transfer, or somebody copying data off to external media like a USB drive. And what this ends up doing is it becomes quite the barrier for organizations who are trying to, where their employees are just trying to go about their business. And when we talk to people like the security officers, the compliance officers, or just the IT managers, one of the things they'll typically tell you is, look, the management overhead that goes with this is ridiculous. We were dealing with one financial organization in Europe, and they were telling us that they had a team of 12 people in the compliance office, and they did not have the time to process all of the alerts they were seeing from their existing DLP solution. Now, one of the things we can talk to organizations about is that we certainly have standalone systems that will plug into the email traffic, the web traffic, the endpoint traffic, or whatever. So if your customers are looking to replace a Barracuda or a Cisco IronPort or a ForcePoint or something like that, we can essentially swap those out with solutions that will give them additional layers of protection and additional mechanisms to protect the organization. But equally, we recognize that your customers may have made a lot of investment in their existing infrastructure. So we also have some complementary solutions where these can work alongside the existing mail infrastructure, internet traffic infrastructure, managed file transfer infrastructure. So they can leave their investment in place, but they can very quickly get these additional benefits from the Clearswift adaptive DLP solutions. And actually, one of the things we find when we look at the DLP suites that are out there is they can often miss hidden information. I'll talk later on about some of the risks we see to organizations around hidden data within imagery in terms of steganography or even just things that are hiding in plain sight, where it might be a scan of a customer record or a patient record, where the existing DLP suite doesn't have the ability to recognize this. So there's a number of things we can do to assist organizations in these areas. The reason we can do this is because all of the Clearswift solutions are built around the same core deep content inspection engine. And this is the engine we've been developing now for over 25 years. This will drill very deeply into your traffic to understand all of the risks within there, and then to give you some additional mechanisms to deal with the risks. So, from a customer's point of view, at a very simple level, what we say here is, because we really understand the traffic, because we inspect the traffic to the greatest degree, they can be confident that when they put a policy in place, that policy will be enforced. So as an example here, if I were to send a zip file as an attachment to an email out of the organization, our engine will take that zip file to pieces. We can drill in there. We can potentially see that there's a Word document within there. We can extract all the text out of that Word document, and we can run that against your lexical expressions to look for sensitive intellectual property or customer details or personally identifiable information. If there's any images embedded in there, like a screenshot of a customer record or a scan of a legal contract or something like that, we can extract those out. And again, we can use optical character recognition to extract the text out of there and run that against our lexical analysis engines. So you get that consistency of detection, regardless of whether the data is in an editable text format or whether it's within an image or a scanned document as well. We'll essentially take the files to pieces as far as we can go. Once we've taken that file to pieces as far as we can go, we'll inspect within the headers of the files to understand what the file is. So if somebody's buried an executable file 12 layers down in a document to try and get that into the organization, and they've renamed .exe to .txt, we would still see that as an executable file because we're not reliant on the file extension. If the policy says this user shouldn't be receiving this type of data, we can block that from entering the organization or whatever. One of the things we did about 9 or 10 years ago was we gave organizations another mechanism. And that was basically not just the ability to inspect the data, but also to make changes to the data as well. So within this PDF file, if I see that this is essentially a scan of a medical record, then yes, I could block this from leaving the organization. Yes, I could encrypt this if it's been shared with somebody who should be able to receive this. But we've also got the ability to make changes to this data. So we can go into that scanned document, we can redact out all the personally identifiable information, the healthcare data, and once we've removed that, we can allow the communication to go on its way. So you remove the risk, but you do it in a way where you're not becoming a barrier to the day-to-day communications and business processes of your customers' employees. Now, if you look at the kind of marketing collateral for Clearswift, it talks about this context and content. And just understanding the content, the data, isn't enough. What we've done is we've spent a lot of time working on the policy model to make it as easily configurable as possible for the organization. Because if you look at something like Office 365, they do DLP and they do compliance, but their policy is a very flat policy for the organization, and it's very time consuming when you try and tailor that to meet the requirements of the organization. What we do is we give you a very granular, a very detailed policy model that allows you to build a very quick baseline of protection, but you can tailor that for all the individual use cases within the organization. So if Louise in my human resources department goes to email a spreadsheet containing the personally identifiable information and the payroll information of the employees to the outsourced payroll providers, and she accidentally clicks on the wrong name in Outlook autocomplete, then when she goes to email that, our email gateway will recognize the presence of this personally identifiable information in these bank account details. It will recognize that this data is not being shared with somebody who should be receiving it outside of the organization, and we can block that from leaving the business. If she is to send that to the correct recipient, our email gateway in this case can recognize that the message is going to the correct recipient, but in this case, because of the presence of the PII data, we have to automatically encrypt that using the appropriate encryption mechanism in order to share that securely with the external recipient within there. If she were to try and copy the same file into the corporate OneDrive account, maybe one of our web solutions, in this case our standalone web gateway, can recognize that she's not allowed to put this data into the cloud, and she can, we'll block her from uploading that from there. If she were to copy the same file off to external media, like a USB drive, or onto a network share within the organization where this data shouldn't be residing, then we've got the ability there perhaps to say, well, because of her job role, we'll block her from copying this to the network share. We will allow her to copy this to her external device, but we'll automatically encrypt that so that if that device gets stolen or lost, the data will still be secure. And so far, this is kind of pretty standard for a DLP solution. We can monitor and report, we can block, we can encrypt. All we did about 9 or 10 years ago was give organizations another set of options when they're coming to deal with this. And this set of options is really designed to remove the risk, but then allow the underlying communication to go on its way. So we can absolutely stop the sensitive information from leaving the organization when it should never be leaving the business. But equally, in those cases where we can remove the risk from the communication and then allow the rest of it to go on its way, you can protect the organization, you can protect the sensitive data, but you can make sure that you're not becoming this barrier to the day-to-day business processes, you're not increasing the management overhead with false positives, and you're not getting the kind of pushback from the organization of, you're just causing us too much pain, dial the policy back, reduce the policy back from there. And the reason we can do this is we have these features that we talk about as our adaptive data loss prevention features. Now, the names for these features really don't mean anything to anyone outside of Clearswift. The key thing here is, and we'll go through and we'll actually demonstrate these in a second, is what we really try and do is we try and encourage you to get prospective customers onto a demonstration. Because when you see this in action, that's typically when you get that light bulb moment from somebody of, I can see how this will complement, how this will be useful for my organization. Again, if you can encourage a proof of concept, a proof of value with the customer, it's very low risk. We can very quickly deploy into the customer's communication flows. We can sit there, We won't make any changes to their data, but we can essentially just gather the information. And what we find in more than 9 times out of 10 is when we do a proof of concept, we will find something that the organization wasn't aware of. We will find the risks that they didn't know about, and then we can show them how we would very quickly be able to mitigate those risks without causing them an excessive amount of pain for the organization. So let's go through and have a look at some of the features that we have. Now, remember, these do work alongside our more standard stop and block and encryption functionality. One of the things we introduced was data redaction. And what data redaction does is it gives us the ability to go into documents, emails, web traffic, managed file transfer traffic, and where we see intellectual property, customer details, personally identifiable information, rather than blocking that communication, we can redact that out and then allow that communication to go on its way. So as I said, what we find in practice is it's best to really demonstrate this to people, because then they really understand how this can be useful to them within their organization. So I'm just going to use my demonstration environment, and here I've got all of the Clearswift solutions running locally in VMware. So it's not the speediest thing in the world because we have a lot of solutions, but hopefully this will give you a good understanding of what we can do that's maybe different from the other vendors that are out there, and how that will bring value to your customers within their communication flow. Now, in this case, I'm going to use our email gateway and our Exchange gateway to scan the data, but equally we can perform the same tasks when we're looking at managed file transfer traffic, going through GoAnywhere, when we're looking at web traffic, going to Dropbox, OneDrive, or just generally to the internet here. Now, what I've attached is I've attached a Word document and a PDF file that contain a number of pieces of personally identifiable information and PCI data, like social security numbers and credit card numbers. What I've also done is I've taken a screenshot of the PDF and I've attached an image here as well, because we typically get questions of, well, what happens if it's a scanned document? What happens if it's a screenshot of a customer record? So I'm going to send this message to somebody within the organization and somebody outside of the organization. Now, we can hook into your customer's internal mail flow, whether that's through on-premise Exchange or whether it's in the cloud in Office 365 or G Suite or something like that. What we're starting to see now is we're starting to see some informs coming back to the original sender to make them aware that something they have sent has been redacted in line with the corporate policy. If I were to step across to my external recipient, so somebody outside of the business here, we can see that we have annotated the message to let the recipient know that we've removed some things in line with the corporate policy. If we have a look in the body of the message, you'll see that we've redacted out all of the words or the tokens that we viewed as being sensitive data. We will remove the whole word, phrase, or token, apart from a credit card number, where we'll leave the last 4 digits intact, because that's kind of pretty standard in terms of handling credit card numbers. If we have a look at the attached documents, if I go into the editable PDF, you'll see that we've been able to do the redaction within there. Equally, if I go into the image file, you'll see that we've been able to do the redaction within the image file as well. And that redaction could be in a simple JPEG, PNG, or bitmap, a simple flat file, but we also support multiple layered files as well. So if you've got customers using Photoshop files who are worried that maybe layer 3 might have the sensitive information, and then the top layer will be an innocent looking picture of a bunny rabbit, then we can extract the text out of all of the layers. We can run it against our lexical analysis engine, so you get that consistency of protection, regardless of whether something is in an editable file format, or a scanned document, or an image entering and leaving the organization. Now, what we find is this redaction functionality gives organizations a way to very quickly increase their data loss prevention controls and their compliance controls. But because we're not stopping the whole communication, because we're just removing the risk, then this gives us the ability to essentially go in there, remove the threat, protect the organization, but don't become this barrier to their day-to-day business processes. With all of the Clearswift solutions where we do redaction or sanitization or anything else like that, we do keep a copy of the data that we redact or sanitize. So if you do get a false positive, where somebody in the maybe the finance team has just sent the payroll information or the accounts to the financial auditor, and we redact something out, then we do have a copy of that message. We can release it in its original unredacted format, but and then tweak the policy very quickly to then, now that we're aware of this new approved necessary communication, to share that data in a secure and an encrypted format. So you get a lot of control here, but what we find in practice, we've had this for about 9 or 10 years now, and I spend a lot of time training customers and partners who use this, is we remove a lot of the risks from the communication, but we do this in a very non-intrusive way, so it allows organizations to very quickly improve their protection without some of the pain associated with the more kind of traditional DLP approaches. With the data redaction, that's typically around the kind of visible information within documents. What we can also do with document sanitization is we can look for the hidden data. So with the document sanitization, we can go in there and we can strip out essentially the metadata, the document properties. We can strip out the unaccepted changes and the version history, and then essentially allow the cleansed document to go on its way. And this proves to be very valuable to organizations, because typically users aren't potentially not aware of all of the additional information that might be useful to an attacker that's hidden within the document properties, like who's created the document, who's reviewed it, which is always useful for maybe trying to phish an employee to trick them into opening a ransomware-laden document, where that sensitive information has come from within the network, which server it was stored on, and so on. Also, what we typically find is users are typically not aware of all of the data in the background of a file, so maybe the unaccepted changes or the version history. So what we can do, again, regardless of whether it's email communications, web communications, managed file transfer, if we have a document that contains a bunch of unaccepted changes and some document comments, and it potentially also contains a whole bunch of information that could be useful to me as an attacker, then what we can do is we can go in there and we can strip out the unaccepted changes, we can strip out the version history, and we can also go and we can strip out the document properties. At this point, we typically get a question from people who maybe use other solutions to do data classification, because those solutions, whether it's SharePoint, Bolden James, Titus, or whatever, will typically write metadata or properties into the metadata of a document. What we can do is we can whitelist certain properties so that when we perform this cleansing, we essentially have the ability to leave the appropriate properties in place and then strip out all of the other risks. So if I were to go and download that Word document through one of our web solutions, in this case it's our standalone web gateway, what you'll see here is the policy that I've configured has essentially accepted all of the unaccepted changes. I've decided to leave the document comments intact because, you can configure this all the way down to the individual elements, because what you might find is some of an organization's legal department might say, well, we actually use track changes and comments when we're working on a contract with a third party. And we can absolutely exempt the legal department when they're sharing data with the third party from some of the elements of this policy. But you see here, we still do get the protection of the redaction, because we found something in there that was too sensitive to be shared with this recipient, so we've automatically redacted it. And if we have a look at the document properties here, you'll be able to see that we've chosen to strip out all of the document properties, apart from this one Titus classification tag that we essentially whitelisted here. So we can work alongside existing DLP solutions. We can find those classification tags. We can ensure that they're not stripped. More importantly, we can actually use those classification tags, whether they're visible within the document in the watermark, the header, the footer, or whether they're in the document properties. We can use those to enforce the policy to make sure that that level of data is only shared with the correct people inside and outside of the organization. And as you've seen, both for the document sanitization and something like the data redaction, we can perform these in real time. So these have just been downloaded from our web solution. As you've seen, it literally is a click. We can take it to pieces, we can redact it, we can sanitize it, and we can serve it back to the user. So it's a very non-intrusive solution from the user's perspective, but from the organization's perspective, it really allows them to dramatically improve the level of protection that they have. A lot of the inquiries we get are from people who are worried about ransomware and malware threats coming into the organizations. And of course, we have the on-box antivirus solutions. We will be introducing sandboxing actually in about a month's time, a couple of months' time. But actually, one of the things we did about 9 or 10 years ago was we introduced this kind of active content sanitization. Because what we found was a lot of organizations where successful ransomware and malware attacks are happening is actually the things that are getting in there are making it past the traditional antivirus solutions, they're making it past the traditional sandboxing solutions, and it could be something as simple as a PDF file that looks like a CV, or it looks like a purchase order going into somebody in the human resources department or the finance department. But within there, there's potentially some active content, some JavaScript, some VB script or macros. What we can essentially do is we can go in there, we can allow the data to go through, but we can strip out the active content. So again, an example always helps here. So I'm going to attach a PDF file to a message that I'm going to send to somebody within my test organization. And this could be a perfectly harmless looking purchase order. That's going to go into the organization. While that does that, I'm just going to open the test file up to show you this. Now, this is a default install of Adobe Acrobat Reader. And with this, as soon as I open the document up, some JavaScript runs. Now, because it's a test file, I've got a little pop-up to make myself aware that the JavaScript has run. But if this was a proper attack, I wouldn't give the user any kind of visible indication that anything has happened here. I would just silently use that JavaScript to kick off the installation of my ransomware or my spyware attack. But this data, this file also contains a lot of data. And what we find with organizations is if you try and block active content from coming into the organization in these common office document formats, what you find is you actually have a lot of false positives because there are a lot of legitimate office documents that will contain some active content. What we can do is we can go in there, we can strip out the active content, and as I open this file up here, you'll see that there's no pop-up, but the data has been left intact. This is a really quick win for your customers. It allows them to really complement their existing traditional antivirus defenses and their traditional sandboxing defenses with a very simple solution that will just go in and strip out all of the active content. And because we're not trying to be smart about it, because we're not trying to tell the difference between good active content and bad active content, you can't trick us like you could do with a sandbox. So we can essentially really dramatically reduce the risk to the organization, but we do it in a way where we don't stop the users from receiving the data they need in the purchase orders, the CVs, or just any of the other thousands of emails they receive every day. One of the things we did about 4 or 5 years ago, and this was traditionally driven by some of our defence and our government customers, but over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, we're actually seeing organisations across all of the other verticals asking for this, is really focused in on how we could look at the risks around imagery and remove the risks from the communication flows. So for some of the organizations we talk to, something as simple as the GPS coordinates where a photo was taken can be viewed as being very sensitive for them. So for a defense organization, for critical national infrastructure like oil and gas, or from oil and gas perspective, just where the GPS coordinates for just where the certain survey information has been taken from can be viewed as being kind of quite sensitive to them. Other organizations were talking to us about the need to look for sensitive data within imagery and scanned documents, and you've already seen how we can find sensitive data within images and scanned documents. Alongside of this, what we've seen over the last few years is the threat of data essentially, or attacks essentially, being hidden within the white space of image files. So people will use these steganography tools to essentially hide data within imagery to try and sneak it out of the organization. And again, this is one where potentially a quick example normally helps. So I've just taken a free tool that I've got from the internet, which will allow me to essentially give it an image. So let's go into my steganography thing here. I've got a picture of some harmless looking bunny rabbits. I'm also going to give it a file. Now in this case, this is the same pieces of personally identifiable information and PCI data that we saw before. And what this tool is going to do is essentially it's going to put that data into the white space within the image file. So there's nothing visible to the naked eye that's going to tell you there's any sensitive information buried within this file. There's nothing within that file that's going to that a DLP solution is going to be able to find, because essentially that data has been encrypted and then it's been buried in the white spaces within there. So what we can do, and I've clearly saved this in the wrong location, so let me just go into my steganography folder and pick it up there. There we go. Here's my hidden image here. What we can do is, nothing visible to the naked eye here. But if one of my users was to email this out of the organization through a traditional DLP solution and then use the same mechanism at the far side, they can essentially get something that's quite happily sailed through their DLP solution. And as long as they've got this passphrase that was used to encrypt the file, they've got the ability to extract the data out and get that out of the organization. Now, in this case, it's a simple text file, but one of my other source images there has 10,000 customer records that was buried within a very simple file. So what we can do with the Clearswift solutions is we can very quickly run anything that goes through our email solutions today, and next year the same will apply to our web solutions. We can run those imagery, whether it's an image that's attached to an email, or whether it's an image that's hidden, inserted in a document attached to an email. We can run those through a very simple cleansing process, and that will essentially leave the integrity of the image intact. So visibly, there will be no difference from the end user's perspective. But we will have gone in there and we will have stripped out this hidden data. So let's call this clean because I'm feeling brave. And if I now use this same tool to try and extract the data out of this image that has gone through one of the Clearswift email solutions, in this case, what we're going to see in the next page is we'll see a simple error message, which just tells us there's no hidden data here. Now, visually, that data, that image is perfectly intact. There's no difference to it, but we've very quickly been able to remove the hidden data within there. And actually, while this started out as a DLP requirement for a lot of our customers, more and more we're seeing it as a requirement to protect from ransomware and spyware attacks, because the same mechanism is being used to hide active content in the white space of an image. And then when that image is viewed in a picture viewer, in a mail client, or within a document viewer like Adobe Acrobat, they can use an exploit to essentially extract the active content out of that white space of the document and use that to get the ransomware or the malware into the business. So we have a number of mechanisms then. We can strip out the metadata, as you saw. We can also, as well as Word documents and PDF files, we can do that metadata sanitization from within image files as well. So we can strip out the GPS locations from within there. We saw the OCR working earlier, where we can find the sensitive data in over 20 different image formats, and we support currently about 48 different languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, Arabic, and so on. We can all perform all of that within there, and then we can simply replace the sensitive data with these nice black bars within our scanned documents and our imagery. And we've got the anti-steganography functionality, which is just in our email solutions today, but it will be coming to our web and our MFT solutions and our endpoint solutions next year, which will very quickly just sanitize out the imagery, both entering and leaving the organization, just to remove these hidden threats that a lot of the traditional DLP and the hygiene solutions will remove from there. I can see there's a question there. Is there a possibility of mail corruption or data corruption after data redaction? No. So we spent a lot of time working on the data redaction and the anti-steganography functionality to make sure that when we rebuild it, we're rebuilding it in the original format. So if your marketing department have spent a lot of time creating these nice Adobe PDF files, we're not going to break the branding or anything like that within there. We will simply go in there, perform the redaction, the sanitization, and rebuild them from that point of view. If we saw something like a digital signature present, where maybe it was a digitally signed PDF, we wouldn't try and do the redaction there because that would obviously break the digital signature. What we would do is we would use one of our additional mechanisms to potentially block that transfer, because we can see some sensitive information that shouldn't be leaving the business unless it's redacted. If we can't redact it, we'll drop that into an unable to redact folder because it was digitally signed, and then the administrator, the compliance officer, can take the decision of what to do off the back of that. What we find in practice then is our adaptive approach allows organizations to very quickly remove the risks of data loss and compliance violations. They can find potentially hidden data in other parts of the communications that their existing solutions are missing, but they can do it in a way that's very non-intrusive for the organization. Now, the solutions we have ourselves will allow us to deploy into the customer's email flow, into their web traffic, their MFT traffic, and their endpoint traffic from there. Now, with these solutions, what we can do is we can work as standalone solutions. So if a customer is looking to replace their existing web proxies, their endpoint solutions, their email solutions, we have standalone solutions that will do that for them. Equally, we have complementary solutions. So something like Argon for email can work alongside a customer's existing email infrastructure. So if they've got a Cisco iron port in place, but they're seeing too many false positives when they try and do DLP there, if they want to extend their DLP policy to look for sensitive data within scanned documents, we can drop our Argon for email solution into their mail flow. We can perform the redaction, the sanitization, the OCR, and complement the existing solution. Equally, if they've got an existing web proxy in place, we can integrate with that over the ICAP protocol. And if they've got a Blue Coat or an F5 or something like that, we can very quickly plug in there and we can bring these additional adaptive DLP controls without them having to essentially rip out a whole bunch of their infrastructure from there. In terms of the solutions we have, we've obviously got the partnerships with GoAnywhere and GlobalScape because they're part of the existing HelpSystems portfolio. If you have existing GoAnywhere customers, then it's maybe worth going back to them and looking at the type of data that they're using to transfer through GoAnywhere and helping them understand that we can integrate with GoAnywhere with our ICAP gateway to remove the risks from their managed file transfer within there. It's very easy to set this up. We have some pre-configured policies we can share with you for kind of proof of concept, proof of value, or for your demonstration environments, both in the GoAnywhere and the Clearswift side of things. From the customer's point of view, this gives them a way of very quickly reducing the risk of malware or ransomware coming into the business using GoAnywhere. Equally, it gives them a way to make sure that GoAnywhere doesn't become the source of a DLP or a compliance violation. We often hear about Office 365 from organizations that we talk to, and what we find is there's a very good complementary story to tell your customers there, because we can work alongside the existing Office 365 infrastructure. We can scan the traffic entering and leaving the business. We can scan the internal traffic, and we can make sure that the redaction, the sanitization can work alongside the existing Office 365 policies. So if you look at Office 365, it doesn't have the ability to do the optical character recognition So if people are sending scanned records or screenshots of records through Office 365, it doesn't have the ability to recognize the data there. It doesn't have the ability to perform this anti-steganography functionality, and it doesn't have the ability to perform this redaction and sanitization. So there's some real value you can bring to your existing customer base, regardless of who they're using for their kind of email server provider. We can essentially work alongside of that and give them these additional benefits of the adaptive DLP controls. We also have an endpoint solution. Now, the Clearswift endpoint solution is designed to really focus in on those things that have to be done at the endpoint. We don't have antivirus within there, so we're designed to work alongside third-party solutions. What we do is we give organizations the ability to perform the device control. You can say at a machine level or at a user level, which ports, which protocols the users can use. You can enforce the redaction or the encryption at this point. We can also look at the data in use. So if people are copying files off to external media, like a USB drive, we can block, we can report, we can notify, we can encrypt, and again, we can perform the redaction within here. If they're copying files off to a network share, we have the same controls here, so you can make sure that somebody isn't putting data into the wrong area of the network. And we also have our data discovery. So we can scan local drives, we can scan network shares to look for sensitive information. And we could just report on that, or we can be more proactive and we can move it somewhere. So if a user has the customer records on their hard drive, or if somebody's put the payroll information into a more publicly accessible area of the network than it should be, we can automatically move those off to a secure area of the network. Somebody can review that data and they can decide whether it should be restored to that location or whether it should be moved to the correct area within the network there. From that point of view. Now, as I've touched on, there's a few slides here that I think we can share the slide deck with you that you might find to be useful. That will talk about things like the target market. With the target market, we get a lot of success with defence, government, utilities, manufacturing, but actually don't discount all of the other verticals, because what we find is they typically have requirements within here. When we're talking to organizations, depending on who we talk to, we might want to stress some slightly different things. With people like the infrastructure managers and the IT managers, these people are typically looking for something that will make the organization more secure, but equally won't increase their management overhead, both in terms of having to deploy and manage the policy, but also in terms of dealing with calls into the help desk. So the easy to configure policy model, the easy to deploy solutions, and the redaction and sanitization mechanisms that give the protection without blocking all the traffic help to kind of address the requirements those customers have and those buyers within the organizations might have. As we move up the chain within an organization and start to talk to people like the information security managers, the compliance officers, the data protection officers, these are the people who really understand the need to protect the sensitive information, but they see the impact in the organization of the more traditional DLP approach. So being able to help them understand that you've got these additional options with redaction and sanitization to protect the data, but do it in a way where you're not causing the organization too much pain, can be really beneficial to them. And equally, when we talk to the kind of chief information security officers, again, they're the people who understand the need for protecting the organization, but also getting the balance right to make sure that you're not becoming this barrier to the day-to-day business processes. And we feel, given our track record over the last 10 years, you have, here good stories that you can tell each one of these kind of buyers or stakeholders within the organization. Obviously, when we're talking to organizations, there are some very kind of general things that might come up in communications about DLP and compliance requirements. But actually, from positioning the Clearswift perspective, what we're really listening for is organizations who have had a bad experience with DLP. They've seen too many false positives. They've seen that data classification DLP solutions are too time consuming, they're too hard to put in place, and they're looking for ways to deal with this kind of thing from there. And there's a few questions we can ask organizations here just to kind of uncover the pain points they have. So typically what we try and do is we understand how organizations are sharing their sensitive data, both inside and outside of the organization. We try and understand the pain points that they have today. And if we hear them talking about the false positives, if we hear them talking about uncertainty of not knowing what users are doing, then we can really encourage them to engage in one of these low risk proof of concepts, and we can be there to uncover the risks, show them what's present, and then show them these additional mechanisms that they might have to deal with these risks here. So that's essentially it from me from the slide deck. I'm just going to go back through some of the questions here because I'm terrible at reading and talking at the same time. So I'm conscious there are a few questions here. So we talked about the mail corruption or the document corruption with data redaction, which is not a worry from us. There's some questions around encryption here. So yes, we have a number of encryption mechanisms that we can use, and I might have hidden the slide. Give me 2 seconds, or just skipped over it, which is pretty slack of me. There we go. So in terms of the encryption options we have both on-box encryption with our email gateway, which can be deployed on-premise or be deployed into the cloud, into AWS or Azure, or through one of our hosting solutions. With the on-premise encryption or the plugin encryption, we support SMIME, we support PGP, we support password-protected zip files. These can be automated, so based upon who's sending the message, who's receiving the message, or based upon the content. So maybe we find some healthcare information within an attachment going to one of the customers. We can kick off the appropriate encryption mechanism within there. And that can be configured based upon email domains or recipients or whatever your requirement is. It's all automated, so the users can send the messages in the clear. We can determine based upon the policy when the encryption needs to happen, and then we'll perform that SMIME, PGP, password-protected encryption in line with the policy. If we're placed between an Exchange server or Office 365 or whatever and an existing spam filter, yes, we can perform the encryption in line within there. So we can essentially sit in line between your mail server, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, and your boundary spam solutions, boundary email solutions. We can perform all of the functionality there. If we see that a message going through us to the outside world needs to be encrypted, we can perform the encryption within there. Equally, if we're getting a message back into the organization, as long as it's allowed through your boundary solution to us, we can do the decryption and send the approved message through to the recipient within the organization after we've content scanned it and removed any additional risks from within there. We also support a portal-based option, and that can be hosted by the customer themselves, or it can be hosted in the cloud. And that's maybe useful if you're talking to members of the public. So it's the kind of business to consumer thing. If you're a government agency talking to your members of the public, if you're a healthcare provider or a financial organization talking to your customers, you can send the message through the encryption portal. It will send an inform onto the recipient with a link in there telling them to create an account or log into their existing account. And when they click on the link, it's like accessing any other kind of webmail portal. They can view the messages, they can save the messages, they can print them off. More importantly, they can reply to them, so you get a nice two-way dialogue within there using a secure mechanism. So there's a variety of options available to your customers, dependent upon what their requirements are within there. There's a question here. So there's a question here just about security transformation and awareness within the organization for the staff as part of a digital transformation. Absolutely, when we look at DLP and compliance projects, we typically talk about people, processes, and technology. And the technology cannot be the only solution. You need it to be there to work alongside the people and the processes. So training the employees, making them, helping them understand what the risks are, helping them understand what the correct procedures are for handling this type of data and sharing this type of data is hugely important. the way I typically position our solutions is they're there as an electronic backstop. So if an employee makes a mistake, and everyone makes mistakes when we're busy, when we're tired, when we're under pressure, somebody will make a mistake. We can be there as that electronic backstop to make sure that that sensitive data, maybe in a hidden column in a spreadsheet, isn't allowed to leave the organization or is redacted before it leaves the organization. As you maybe saw in the demonstration, whenever I triggered the policy, we sent informed messages back to the original sender. And you can do this with all of the solutions. So you can perform some of that just-in-time training where a user violates the policy, you stop the violation from happening, whether you're blocking or encrypting or redacting or sanitizing. But more importantly, you can also send the informs back to the original sender to make them aware of the policy violations so that they hopefully learn from it and don't do it again. Equally, you can make their manager aware. You can make the security officer, the compliance officer aware. So if they see a repeated pattern of breaches, then they might take some additional steps with that employee. So absolutely, having the people and the processes and the training to work alongside of the solutions is hugely important to make sure that you get the effective deployment within here. We've answered the encryption question. With the Exchange Gateway, we have the ability with the Exchange Gateway to plug into your customers' Exchange infrastructure and to work alongside the internal information sharing. The Exchange Gateway doesn't have an encryption module built into that. We would typically see that being performed by the email gateway when it's data entering and leaving the organization. But what you'll find is if you deploy our email gateway and our Exchange Gateway, you can pair them together and you can manage them from a single point. So if I look at my email gateway here, what we can actually see is that it's got the plugin for the Exchange infrastructure. It's got the encryption functionality. So while these are separate, physical or virtual servers, both on-premise or in the cloud, from the customer's point of view, once they've been deployed, once they've been integrated into the incoming and outgoing mail flow and the internal mail flow, you can essentially manage the policy from a single point within there. So if you've got a customer who wants to look at their internal traffic, then the Exchange Gateway makes a lot of sense. If they also have the requirement to perform encryption around incoming and outgoing traffic, then that's where our email gateway deployed alongside of that would make a lot of sense within there. There's a question there about, do we need separate SSL certificates? So the gateways have their own self-signed certificates, both for web and email. But obviously, if you want to do TLS for the external world, you would probably want to replace those with the customer's official TLS certificates. And equally, for hooking into the customer's web traffic, again, you can use a self-signed cert, but it's maybe better if you use one that's been issued to the customer by an official CA, so there's no kind of worries about browser warnings within there. So there is one question here about the challenges of policy-based email encryption around spam emails and so on. What we do is if data is crossing the gateway that's encrypted and we don't have the mechanism to do the decryption, we will not allow that to be delivered. And that's our out-of-the-box default mechanism there. Now, typically, we would recommend that the customers do gateway-to-gateway encryption so that we have the mechanism to encrypt when the users send in the clear. Equally, when an encrypted file comes back into us, we will have the mechanism to decrypt that data before sending it to the users in the clear. By doing that, we get the ability to do the content inspection at the gateway level. If you have the more secure organizations where you have users encrypting at the desktop using PGP and SMIME, then there is more management in terms of setting this up. But if we can set it up where we get some the appropriate keys in place, we do have the ability to allow the users to send encrypted from the desktop, to decrypt at the gateway, do the content and scanning, the redaction, the sanitization, and re-encrypt it before letting it outside of the organization. So, short answer, by default, if it's encrypted and we can't content scan it, it doesn't cross us, we will block it. If we do have the mechanism to do the decryption, we can do the content analysis to look for these additional spam risks, malware risks, and ransomware risks, or DLP risks from that point of view. And with that, I think we've worked through all the questions, so I will hand you back to Vipin.
Thanks, Nick, for your wonderful sessions. Guys, if you have any questions, any suggestions regarding this our product or the presentations, please feel free to send us your feedbacks, and we will be able to address you on this session. Any other questions?
There was one question that came in just asking that for proof of concept for the email gateway, is it a VM or a software installation? It can be any of these things. So we can deploy onto a physical server. Anything that runs Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7 will support one of our gateways. We can deploy into virtualization on-premise like vSphere and Hyper-V. We can deploy into the cloud, into AWS and Azure, and we have our own kind of hosting and managed options as well.
So there is a feedback session at the end. So I request all the attendees to fill that your feedback so that we will be able to get in touch with you for any questions. That's all from my side. Nick, anything to?
No, it's all good from my point. There was the question that just came in about the pricing side of things. I think if you guys talk to Vipin and so on, they can share the pricing with you. Yeah.
Yeah, the pricing part we can address it separately offline. So I'll be in touch with you guys for the reason regarding the pricing part and the POC part also.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you all for your time. Thank you. Have a nice day.